This morning, our topic is, and it's taken from Exodus 4, is knowing what to do when we don't know what to do. It might sound a strange topic, but that's the position that Moses found himself in. And we're taking a look at some of the lessons of Moses, but it's in Exodus chapter 4, verses 18 through 31. And it's not as though Moses didn't know what God wanted him to do. He just wasn't sure about how he was going to prepare himself to do the task that he'd been asked of it. When we think about it, he'd run away from his past to the desert. That's about as far away as you can get from your past, where he felt he was safe. But in those 40 years in the desert, he found himself empty and unsatisfied with life. However, after getting married and looking after somebody else's sheep, he found himself in a comfort zone and was reluctant to step out into a situation that may expose him to failure once again. Now let me ask you a question this morning. How many of you like change? Oh, that's brilliant. Not one person put their hand up. Just indicate how many of you like change. I didn't ask any conditions. I just said one person likes change. What's the matter with the rest of you? Are you resistant to change? You don't like change? Why don't you like change? Or should I say, why is it that we don't like change? Or we don't want to think about change? Well, it might change us. But I think sometimes we're reluctant to change because we're being asked to step outside our comfort zones. You know, we become very comfortable in the things we know and our surroundings and the people that we associate with. So if we take all those things away, we're not so sure or confident about ourselves. And so often we're resistant to change. And yet, change is happening all around us. And often when change happens, we're very reluctant or very resistant to change. Let me give you an update. What do you think of the lockdowns? What do you mean it hasn't affected you? Here in the Territory, we're blessed more than most other people, but it's still a change that we have to get used to. It's not as though a matter you can just go to the airport, get on a plane and go. There are new restrictions now. You have to wear a mask. Now, for here in the Northern Territory, we're not used to wearing masks at all. But it's a new restriction. It's been asking us to change our behaviour and our lifestyle as well. And some people find that very resistant. They don't want to do it. And yet Moses was no different, because God was challenging him to step outside his comfort zone of 40 years of looking after sheep, being married with 2 boys, etc., and say, you're going to go to Pharaoh, you're going to tell him, set my people free. He was reluctant. He's resistant. I mean, everything he knew for the 40 years, hey, it's here in the desert, and he's been asked to step outside that comfort zone, and it involves that element of risk of changing, because sometimes we're afraid of what might happen. But this morning we're going to travel with Moses and see how he dealt with that challenge to change. And the first thing that we've got is, might help if I turn it on. An act of commitment. And as this says, Motivation is what gets you started. Commitment is what keeps you going. Now, some of you, well, not many people here made any New Year's resolutions at all. They had no motivation whatsoever. So if you don't have a motivation, you won't commit yourself to doing something you know you're not going to do. And so this act of commitment, I have no doubts, Moses had no doubt he was God's man for the time. He tried as many excuses as we looked at last week to tell God, I can't do this, I'm not the person, but it didn't work. God wasn't having a bar of it. He didn't accept any excuses, and he always had an answer for him. Now, he knew what he had to do, but he wasn't sure about how he was going to do it. But he knew it meant stepping out of his comfort zone. He knew that it meant confronting people who he didn't want to. And he had to try and convince people that he was the real deal from God as their deliverer. So there's so many things that are involved in this change that God's asking him to do. But it requires an act of commitment. There's the acknowledgement in verse 18. And that acknowledgement we find, so Moses went back to his father-in-law Jethro and said to him, let me go so that I may return to my relatives in Egypt and see if they are still alive. Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. Go in peace. Now, I'm saying this very clearly. Moses knew what God wanted him to do. There was no misunderstanding. He understood what he was supposed to do. And he also realized it wasn't just a matter of getting up and leaving without giving some sort of explanation to those in his family or his father-in-law as well. You just don't pack up and go and say nothing to anyone. So he understood that he had to do something. But he's got a problem. How do you go to your father-in-law and say, look, father-in-law, I had this experience with a burning bush. I was out in the desert looking after your sheep, and this burning bush spoke, and it told me that I had been chosen to be the one to go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. What do you think of that? How do you tell people that are close to you that's what God told you to do? Now, I know if I came and told you, look, I was out doing this and I had the tree speak to me and tell me I had to do something, what would you automatically think? You would think I'd lost my marbles. You would think I'm a strange sort of person. What sort of a person does a tree talk to? Doesn't talk to me. So you would think I'm nuts. In Moses' case, they probably thought he'd been out in the sun too long or around sheep too long. But it didn't deter Moses from doing what he had to do. There was a maturity, there was a sensitivity to go to his father-in-law and tell him, and he just told him, I'm leaving and I'm taking my wife, your daughter, and my 2 sons with me to visit my own family in Egypt. And this makes sense. Jethro had been the person who gave him a home in Midian. He was also the person who gave him one of his daughters to marry. So it makes sense that he go and tell him what he's about to do. But it's also a mark of respect. For Jethro was the head of the clan. And in ancient times, you didn't do anything without telling the person who was in control what you were doing. It was disrespecting. So he respected Jethro. But also, Jethro was Moses' employer. So he needed to return the sheep to him before he left him. He couldn't just leave him in the desert. Now, some people argue, well, Moses wasn't completely truthful with Jethro. He didn't tell him the real reason that he was going, because he knew Jethro wouldn't approve of him doing something foolhardy with his daughter and children, like going into the territory of his enemy. It also reveals to us that Moses is still uncertain about what he is doing. He knows he must go. but he's not given a book with all the details filled in for him. He's just told to go. God gives him a promise, I'm going with you. But he doesn't fill in every little detail about what Moses is to do when he calls him. He has the promise of God, and he only knows that God exists, but he doesn't know much else. Even though he's been exposed to some of the miracles that God showed him at the burning bush, he still didn't know too much about this God. And when I was thinking about it from Moses' perspective, Moses had become disillusioned with life. He saw himself as a bit of a failure. He saw the Hebrew people who he had tried to help as being hopeless. And when it came to the person of God, he saw him as uncaring, unfaithful, and impotent when it came to delivering his own people. This was Moses at this point in his life. Now, where had this type of thinking come from? And it stems from Moses' past. Moses saw his own inability to get the job done. And honestly, he didn't think that God could do much better than he could. That was where his confidence was. Despite God showing him all his power of the miracles in the desert, it wasn't enough to convince him that God could do what he said. Nevertheless, he makes his commitment and leaves his family, or leaves with his family. And the affirmation is given, in verse 19, as you will see, it's a very short verse. And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, because all the men who were seeking your life are dead. So here's Moses, still with some doubts in his mind about going to Egypt. And I guess the question we need to ask here, if Moses didn't have the confidence to tell somebody, meaning Jethro, who we'd known for 40 years, what he was going to do and why he was doing it, how then would he have the courage to face Pharaoh and demand that the children of Israel be let go? You see, he's afraid to tell Jethro, and yet here he is to set off to tell the most powerful man in the world, let my people go. Where is to find his courage? Now, once again, it's Moses struggling with his past. He's struggling with his doubts. He's struggling with his anxiety. And he's asking himself, how can I go back to Egypt? How can I be a success when I've failed before? He was doubting that it was even possible. He was doubting. Now, sometimes if we haven't dealt with or confronted our past, it always remains there, and it causes anxiety, it causes doubts in our minds, and until we deal with our past, we can never move forward to deal with what's in front of us. The past always seems to hold us back. And in this case, Moses had to overcome his doubts about his own ability. He thought he was going to do this in his own strength, with his own gifts, with his own abilities, and his own power. And I wonder how many here today have tried to do that. They've tried to do it in their own strength, their own abilities and resources, and failed. And as a result, they have some doubts. They have some anxieties, particularly when God comes calling and says, this is what I want you to do. Now, God gave him the answer. He promised to be with him. And he wants him to go to Egypt. And he wants him to go to Egypt because the times, the people, and the circumstances have changed. They're not like they used to be 40 years prior. And there's a lot of water goes under the bridge in 40 years. People and places changes. Now, I came from a place in Layla Park in New South Wales, and I go back, it's not the same place that it was when I grew up as a boy. It's changed. It's wall-to-wall houses, places where you could go over the railway line in Blacktown and shoot rabbits to your heart's content. If you go over the bridge today, you won't see a rabbit within cooey of that area because it's wall-to-wall houses as far as you can see. The market gardens, all gone. People and places change. We change as well. But what it meant is that the people who were seeking to kill Moses had died. And so Egypt was now under new management. And that's significant because when there was a change of government, no longer do the law for a criminal is enforced, because the new government would come in and cancel any criminal charges under the old government and grant amnesty and pardon to those who had been sought under the last government. So it was all changed. All changed. So God had taken care of that. And we see the authority in verse 20, where it says, "Then Moses took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, headed back to the land of Egypt, and Moses took the staff of God in his hand." Now God had confronted and dealt with all of Moses' excuses as to why he shouldn't do this mission that he called him to. And God deals with every one of our objections. He dealt with my objections as to why I shouldn't be here. I didn't have an answer. He did. But I had to confront. I had to tell God why I didn't think I should be here. And he overruled. Now Moses sets off with his family by his side for the support. But more than that, he carried the rod of God in his hand as his authority. And this rod or staff would be the symbol of God's authority, that Moses was going to deliver his people through the miracles he was to perform with that staff. So he had the authority of God with him in a physical sense, because that staff represented God's presence with him, and he understood that. So he had that confidence. And this is the assured confidence that we have, trusting God when things don't make sense. And I think we've all been there, where we've been asked to step out and we're not sure what God is trying to teach us. But we're trusting God nonetheless. And we have this assured confidence. At this point, if I'd have been in Moses' shoe, my confidence would have started to just go up that little bit. I'm starting off, I've headed off, I have my wife, I have the symbol of God's authority with me. I understood and knew that God had called me to the Hebrew people to deliver them. I knew that God was powerful. He'd shown me these miracles, and I had his staff with me. So I'm pretty confident to the thing, what could possibly go wrong? I had everything going for me. Everything should come together nicely, and I'd be thinking, let's get this over and done with, and no problems at all. So I'm starting off with a good frame of mind. But isn't it interesting how long it will take before that changes? Because what I've said here is called it the antagonism in verse 21. And verse 21 says, "The Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the wonders I have put under your control. But I will harden his heart, and he will not let the people go." This is rather interesting. I'm in a good frame of mind. I'm looking forward to this challenge. And God says, now don't forget, Moses. You do what I've told you. You show the signs and wonders. But I always like it in Scripture when it says but. You know, there's always this but. When you hear but, what does it remind you of? You know, you're looking forward to things, but there's something there. And God says, but I will harden his heart and he won't let the people go. What a bombshell that would be. You know, I'm doing what you want me to, God. You're telling me that I'm the man that you want to go to Egypt to deliver your people, And now you're saying it's not going to be an easy task. Expect some opposition. Expect some resistance from Pharaoh to his request. But to add injury to insult, God tells Moses, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he doesn't let the people go. What do you think of that? If you're in Moses' position now, what would you be thinking? It's going to be very hard. What else would you be thinking? Well, yeah, why me? Well, he's already told God he can't do it, but God said you will do it. But wouldn't you be thinking to yourself, what's the point of me going to Egypt to tell this guy, let my people go, and here you are working against me? I thought we were on the same team, God. What are you doing? What's the point of me doing it when you're undermining what I'm doing? And I'm just doing what you told me to do. Wow. I wonder how many of us have been in that position before. Maybe too many times that we'd rather not reply. Now, we might be thinking from a human perspective, well, that's not fair, God. I mean, he's forcing Pharaoh to make this decision, and then he goes and punishes Pharaoh and all of Egypt for doing it. How fair is that? And I guess this is a difficulty that many people have with understanding God's sovereignty and man's free will. Now, what do I mean by God's sovereignty? God's sovereign, but what do we mean by God as sovereign? He is God and he can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, because he can. That's sovereignty. He doesn't have to ask your permission or my position. He can do whatever he wants because he's God. Now, how does my free will work? If I told you you can't do something, would you just accept it? You'd accept it? Why not? If I'm your boss and I say you can't do that thing, will you accept that I have the authority to tell you no? Well, let me put it another way. The government says don't do this and don't do that. Are you going to accept it? Be careful because you never know. You see, we've got a free will. And that free will allows us to think, to engage, to express opinion, and to either accept or reject what we can or can't do. Free will is being free to do and say what you want. Now, would you want to change that? Yes or no? As human beings, we like our free will. We don't want to be robots. We don't want to be told what to do, when to do it, how to do it. We have the free choices to make, and that's the use of our free will. And so we're allowed to express our free will and accept the consequences and responsibilities for our choices and decisions. And we wouldn't want to change that. If I make a decision and I mess up, who takes the responsibility for it? I do. I can't blame anybody else. It was me that made that decision. And from that, I would hope that I would learn not to do certain things again. But that is the way that we enjoy our society, rather than being programmed as a robot with things to do. And what our text is saying is that God used what was already in Pharaoh's heart and mind, which was in opposition to God, because Pharaoh believed he was a God himself. And this is what a lot of people don't understand. Pharaoh believed that he was a God himself. And so God allowed him to continue to resist and rebel against him in order to show him otherwise. And I think God is explaining to Moses how all this is going to pan out. Not to take the resistance or the rejection to his request personally when he's refused. God is assuring Moses that he's the one that's in control by telling him, don't get frightened, don't get discouraged. When things don't seem to be going your way, stay the course. I know what Pharaoh is doing, and I'll use it against him to show it was a wrong choice. So you've got God's sovereignty, man's free will working together. It's not a matter of being fair or not. God's taking what's there and making it and using it to show Pharaoh's choices and that they were wrong. We then have the appointment, and that appointment in verse 22. You must say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord has said, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Strange thing to say to Pharaoh, but it's a significant message, and it would challenge Pharaoh's belief system and power in a way that Pharaoh alone would come to understand. The Egyptians believed the firstborn son was special and sacred. And so God is challenging Pharaoh here because Pharaoh thought himself to be the only son of the gods. That's what he thought of himself. Now he hears Moses tell him that there's a whole group of people who are designated as being God's firstborn son, meaning they are on the same level as he was, that they were to be treated with all the rights and privileges that belong to the gods. Now Pharaoh, hearing this, he's not going to have a bar of this. Not at all. He's going to fight this. He believed that the Hebrew people only had the rights and privileges that they got because he, as God, allowed them. They were his slaves. He was their God. They were there to do whatever he commanded them, or they died. So, as far as he was concerned, they were slaves, nothing more as far as he was concerned. So you can see the first power play that's happening. God is challenging Pharaoh's thought that he was a God himself. He was going to show him who God really was. And the assertion in verse 23, and I said to you, let my son go that he may serve me, but since you have refused to let him go, I'll surely kill your son, the firstborn. Now the message is clear. It's challenging Pharaoh's power and authority. If he didn't allow God's people to go and serve him as requested, then what he's saying to Pharaoh is, I'll take your firstborn son. In other words, they'll be killed. Israel is referred to as a whole nation. Pharaoh's firstborn also is included in the firstborn in the land. Now it's interesting that Pharaoh's hardness also leads to an interesting coincidence. Egypt has its own text or version of what happened concerning an overthrow of the kingdom. And guess what that prediction was? In the so-called coffin text, there is a prediction that the kingdom will fall when the son of Horus could no longer to protect the children. So the attack on the firstborn of all Egypt, except those who are covered with the blood, again personal and meaningful choice, is a direct attack on Pharaoh's authority. And where did God strike? Where it hurt the most. Pharaoh, the same place where God had been hurt. And God claimed all of Israel as his firstborn, God's own heir and privileged child. So you can see the contest that's starting to shape up. We have an approved consecration in verses 24 and 26. And it seems strange that stuck in here, it's something that's difficult to understand. Why was it stuck here? It seems that the message from this section of verses indicates to us the importance of being in a right relationship with God before we serve Him. And that means we need to stop, examine and acknowledge any areas of sin that we have hidden or concealed over the years. Otherwise, this will make our commitment to Him null and void, and God will not use us. It seems strange to stick it here, but we're going to find out. It's what I call here the assassination in verse 24. Now on the way, at a place where they stopped for the night, the Lord met Moses and sought to kill him. In our text, Moses must have forgotten or had not yet learned that obedience is the priority when walking with God. Before God could use Moses to lead his people that he had made a covenant with, then Moses was expected to live under the same terms and condition of the covenant as required by everybody else. In this regard, Moses was guilty of not dedicating his own son to God, and he violated the covenant which requires a person to be punished by death. That's the terms of the covenant. This passage makes it plain that God was going to deal with Moses for this oversight, even if it meant that Moses forfeited his life and his mission. That's how seriously God takes the matter of sin. And it doesn't matter who you are. There are no shortcuts. There are no overlooking things that have been done wrongly. The challenge is make it right. And I think I'll put this up. In Genesis 17:10-4, you will see the requirements that are here. This is my requirement that you and your descendants after you must keep, meaning that was given to Abraham. Every male among you must be circumcised. You must circumcise the flesh of your foreskins. This will be a reminder of the covenant between me and you. Throughout your generations, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, whether born in your house or bought with money from any foreigner who is not one of your descendants. They must indeed be circumcised, whether born in your house or bought with money. The sign of my covenant will be visible in your flesh as a permanent reminder. Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin will be cut off from his people. He has failed to carry out my requirement. God took this seriously. This is something Moses should have known and probably did know. But we see the action that took place here in verse 25. But Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off the foreskin of her son, touched it to Moses' feet and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." Why hadn't Moses circumcised his son? He couldn't plead ignorance. He knew what was required. There are some thoughts that maybe Zipporah had put her foot down after the first son had been circumcised because she thought it was disgusting and wouldn't allow Moses to do what he was supposed to do. Now this is pure speculation, but there seems to be some evidence that this was something the Midian people, of who her father was a high priest, they didn't do circumcision until a child was in puberty. But it seems that Moses was incapacitated to do something. But it's thought he gave instructions to Zipporah on how to perform this circumcision, which he had resisted and found distasteful. Now let me make it clear, it's not the son's fault that he hadn't been circumcised. It was Moses' responsibility as a father to have it done. And it was Moses who was to be punished for his disobedience. And it didn't take long for his wife Zipporah to understand just how bad the situation really was. So she acted swiftly and she did the deed. She performed the circumcision that clearly identified her child as part of Israel, God's chosen people. Second, she threw the bloodied foreskin at somebody's feet so that the blood symbolized the covering, a payment for whatever was wrong. Maybe she thought, if I don't do this, I'll not only lose my husband, but my son also. So she stepped up and she did the deed. The lesson Moses was to learn, that if he was going to serve the Lord, he had to obey the commandments, even when loved ones closest to him objected. So, before he could lead the covenant people as an example, he first had to make sure that he carried out the commandments. And God held him to account. And he holds us accountable as well. Well, verse 26 is the acceptance. So the Lord let him alone. At that time, she said, a bridegroom of blood, referring to the circumcision. Now let me tell you this, husbands. When your wife has to do what you don't do, they're not in very good moods. And Zipporah was not in a lovey-dovey mood with her husband right now. What did she call him? Now, I'm not going to use modern language because I can't translate it enough to get the message across. But she emphasized it twice, that she was not very happy with her husband. It's not a term of endearment in his situation. It had been a dramatic experience for her. And the whole thing had disgusted her. And it seems from this point on in time, she separates herself from Moses. And we don't hear about her or his two sons until Exodus chapter 18, when she returns to meet him in the wilderness. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, Pastor, what's the big deal about circumcision? Why did God make a big deal out of it? Moses' disobedience in this crucial area revealed a lack of complete surrender and obedience on his part. And because the leader of Israel, who had not brought his own family into the covenant faithfulness to God, would become a stumbling block to Israel instead of a help. How could the people be expected to follow Moses when Moses himself was disobedient? How could the people trust that Moses was God's man when Moses wasn't following God's instructions? How could the people even really believe that Moses was hearing from God if he apparently had not even heeded God's call in the basic matter of identity and obedience? Now we say, oh, it's only a small thing, it's a little thing. But small things lead to big things. And if we can't do the little things, we won't do the big things. And usually, disobedience in big things gets us into a whole heap more trouble. How could Moses be expected to demonstrate obedience to God in the fiery trials that he was about to face if he hadn't demonstrated just such a simple matter of circumcising his son? In this, Moses was guilty. He had sinned. And so God was coming to execute judgment upon Moses. And if you like, Zipporah, his wife, is his intercessor. She acted. And she threw the foreskin at Moses' feet. And so Moses was covered in the blood of the son. God did not execute judgment on Moses because he was under the blood of the son. Now, if I had more time, I'd go and unpack that, because it's a beautiful picture of salvation, of what God has done for us. Every one of us deserves the judgment and wrath of God because of our sin. But it's because of the Son's shed blood that we are covered when we come in faith to him. So it's a beautiful picture of salvation just in those verses. I could have spent another hour just on those verses, but thankfully, Rhonda, you don't have to have that. An agreed collaboration in verses 27 and 31. God knew Moses, more than anybody else, needed support and encouragement for the job ahead. His wife and sons had gone back to Midian, but God, had already provided the support system that he needed. His brother Aaron was already on the way. And God knew Moses would need somebody else to convince his people that he was indeed God's man for the moment. And so he would need Aaron to be by his side with his connections. And so the alliance is made in verses 27 and 28. The Lord said to Aaron, "Go to the wilderness to meet Moses." So he went and met him at the mountain of God, greeted him with a kiss. Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord who had sent him, all the signs that he had commanded him. Isn't it interesting to see how God works? He was already working in Aaron's heart. He was already making plans. It was well orchestrated what was needed. And I can only imagine the happy reunion it must have been. Two brothers separated for 40 odd years. How much time would you have to catch up? Plenty. What would you say? What would you share? What had happened in 40 years? And it must have been exciting for Moses to tell Aaron the different events in his life, the things that he'd been doing, how he's married, how he was a father with 2 sons, and then the burning bush experience where God had given him his commission, and the part that Aaron was to play in all of this. Now I can only speculate about Aaron's response to all this, but it wasn't a chance encounter that had brought them together. If you like, this was a mountaintop experience where God was confirming to Moses this was all he's doing. Aaron had not only come as God had said, but he came to the very place where God said he would be, the very place where God had revealed himself to Moses. Just coincidence, or God working everything perfectly out for his plan? Very quickly, the authentication in verse 29. Then Moses and Aaron went and brought together all the Israelite elders. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses, did the signs in the sight of the people. Now God's already one step ahead of everybody else in the planning and what is required. Now one of Moses' beefs or excuses was, what if the people don't believe me? What if the people won't listen to me and accept that I'm the person to do what you ask? And this is where God had prepared Aaron to be part of the solution. Aaron provided Moses with credibility to the Jewish people, especially to the elders in Israel. Aaron himself was an elder of Israel. He had the means and the freedom to leave Egypt. He had the clout to introduce Moses to the leaders of Israel. For all intents and purposes, Moses to the people of Israel was considered an outsider, a person they didn't know much about. Some may have vaguely remembered the incident when he killed an Egyptian and ran off to the desert. But they were cautious about him. They were very cautious about what he wanted. Aaron solved this dilemma. He opened the doors that Moses would have been otherwise had shut to him. And so Moses is presented to the elders to present his case, and the people are shown some of the signs and power of God to authenticate to them that he was indeed the person God wanted. And lastly, the apprehension in verse 31, and the people believed when they heard that the Lord had attended to the Israelites and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed down close to the ground. To see the people believe and accept him would have done wonders for Moses' confidence. But one of his greatest fears was that of rejection. The people endorsed what God had already told him. Trust me and I will show you who I am and what I can do. In other words, all the fears, all the excuses of Moses had been groundless concerning the people's rejecting of him. What it did was expose his own doubts and unbelief that he had hidden away within him. God wasn't acting on Moses' part. He was fulfilling the covenant that he made with Abraham, and Moses was simply the instrument he had chosen to do the task. The people gave the right response. They had been wanting their freedom for over 400 years. Now it seemed to them it was going to happen, and the people began to give God the glory. They knelt in the desert sands of Egypt to praise their God. They knew and understood now who he was. He was the God of Moses. He was the God who had seen their misery. He was the God who had seen their suffering. He was the God who was about to answer their prayers. He alone is worthy of their praise. Now Moses had been challenged about what to do and how he was going to do it. He wasn't sure of many things, but what he was taught here are valuable lessons that would enable him to become God's leader of the people in the future. And I wonder this morning, what things has God been trying to teach you and me? How far have we got in our education? Has he called us? Are we still making excuses as to why I can't do that, I'm not very good at this, I'm not very good at that, I haven't got the skills, I just haven't got the connection, I just don't want to do it? Or can we say, yes, God is saying to me, I want you to get out of your comfort zone, I want you to trust and follow me. Take this journey with me and I'll show you great and mighty things that you have not seen. Or are we happy to be in our comfort zone? People we know, places, everything is familiar. And God has been saying to you, I want to use you and you and you and you. Will you follow me? And he's still waiting for his answer. Are you ready to respond? Are you ready to take